Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby. In episode 48, we're going to look at an interview that Dewi Evans gave to Raj Persaud, the celebrity psychiatrist. And the interview happened not long after Letby was convicted, and Dewi was going from studio to studio to take credit for her conviction. So it's about a year old, and it precedes the growing unease over this conviction. People fall into roughly four groups when it comes to Lucy Letby. The Lucy Letby did it group, the Lucy Letby didn't do it group, the I don't know if Lucy Letby did it, and the group I'm in, there is no way on earth Lucy Letby did what they said she did. In Judith Morris' book, Unmasking Lucy Letby, Dewi Evans, when speaking to Judith Morris, said that Lucy Letby killed those bloody babies. And it seems to me that Dewi Evans really believes that. But it's not a rational belief. It's more akin to a religious belief. Dewi never argues facts or offers explanations. He expects everyone to believe his story simply because he believes his story. The basis of science is not what most people think, proving something to be true, but rather falsifying something as not true. So for 400 years or more, everyone believed that Newton's laws of gravity explained gravity and that one large body would pull a smaller body towards it. And the reason they believed it is because it worked. And Newtonian mathematics that allowed people to build bridges and churches and castles and all kinds of things. Always worked. And therefore Newton was right. And until Einstein developed the theory of general relativity, no one seemed to ask the question, could Newtonian calculations be correct, but for a different reason? Well, it turns out that Newtonian calculations aren't correct, but they're close enough to work and are highly predictable of what will happen on Earth and in the solar system under the force of gravity. Not correct, but useful is the Dewi Evans approach to science, which combined with extreme cognitive dissonance provides the explanation for his persistent modus operandi. We'll listen to a little bit of Raj Persaud's interview now, and I can't help but notice the total skepticism and cynicism, indeed, that Raj has towards Dewi Evans and the totality of this ridiculous story. And we'll punctuate the interview only to show that what Dewi says in the interview, and for the most part continues to say until he changes his mind and then changes it back again, is his beliefs and nothing else.
Let's talk a bit about how did you get involved in the Lucy Letby case? What was the sequence of events?
So I read in the Sunday paper that there were concerns about the number of deaths of babies, and I think the report said actually in Chester, and that the police had been called in. So I had an email regarding another case to the NCA, and I said, by the way, I've read about this case in Chester where there are concerns regarding babies dying. And it was an off-the-cuff remark, and I said, this sounds like my kind of case, because of course it was.
What Dewi isn't going to tell us now is that all of the babies that Lucy Letby is supposed to have murdered had postmortems which did not show any evidence of foul play at all. They had all had secondary reviews by senior current neonatologists who didn't find anything untoward at all, and that the hospital itself had suffered a humiliating review by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, criticised virtually every aspect of it. And so even in the first sentence of his response to Raj, he is taking ownership of this case. When he says my kind of case, he means that quite.
I dealt with numerous cases of for the police, and I'd also, I think more importantly, dealt with numerous baby cases from a clinical negligence point of view.
So that's the basis of Dewi's qualification for this case. He knew Nick at the NCA, and he had done cases.
And neonatal care was something that was infused in my marrow, really. I've been involved with looking after sick babies from my mid-20s.
Dewi is now telling us what this case means to him. It's not just a case. It's personal. It's in his marrow, not his brain.
So the NSA came back to me and said,
he went after them. And he's telling us now that this is his case. He is going to determine the outcome of no matter what it may cost.
where do we go next? So I said, look, I'll go up to Chester. This was in July 2017, lovely summer's day, as it is in Wales all the time, of course. So I drove up to Chester, met the police, and said, look, I've no idea what's going on here, but get me the clinical notes of 1 or 2 babies so that I've got some sort of feel of what you're investigating. So I arrived there, met the DI, the inspector, Paul Hughes, and his team, Adam Bolger, Janet Moore, and others. And I had a look at one of the cases, in fact, one of the last babies who died. And I was rifling through the notes, and a couple of things struck me quickly. The notes were generally of good quality. There was obviously good consultant input into these cases.
This is the case of Baby O, who was subject to the horrendous assault at the Mark McDonald press conference recently. We find out that one of these consultants actually stuck a needle into the liver of a baby from the right-hand side of the body without any imaging to guide the needle, and withdrew blood immediately from the liver. And within a short space of time, the baby's hemoglobin dropped by 50%. That's how good the consultant input into the case was.
And I found something that shouldn't be there. One of the medics had written down that he'd noticed what he thought was bruising over the area of the liver. Well, that doesn't happen. And
it's important that you notice the staccato nature of his speech when he's referring to the case and the cases, as opposed to when he's just talking generally about himself. During the trial, the same consultant who stuck the needle into the baby also said that the bruising that he had noticed on the baby's chest over the area of the liver wasn't bruising at all. And Dewi knows that now because that was something that he mentioned himself during the trial, that this wasn't bruising. But he's now telling Raj that the finding of this bruising was going to lead to something really important. And that's what I mean by cognitive.
I got the post-mortem results as well, and saw some pretty florid, horrid photographs that showed several.
There are multiple reasons why a liver would bleed in a preterm neonate. We've talked about that before, but Dewi uses only trauma as an explanation for it. But he doesn't mention that it was the consultant who actually inflicted the trauma. He takes a very long pause where he's either trying to remember something or keep his story straight. And it's always very suspicious when someone is speaking to you that way. And when you're sitting back like Raj is doing and you're listening to the person, you're trying to discern what they're saying, what way they're thinking. When they take a long pause from a fluent flow that had preceded it, it's a good idea that you go on alert, because they're either trying to recall something or construct something that's going to make sense and match with the previous fluent flow of thought. And Dowie had mentioned photographs in his previous fluent flow of thought. And the reason that he's pausing, I think, is because he's actually recalling the photographs. And one of them that he's recalling is the photograph of the insertion point of the needle that Richard Taylor referred to in Mark MacDonald's press conference, and which on its own completely negates the trauma theory of injury to the liver and exonerates Lucy Letby.
And I thought, oh my God, this is dreadful. This is inflicted injury. So right from the beginning, I said, look, this is inflicted injury. We need to investigate this. And
I'm only speculating here now, but they referred to Baby O as the tipping point, the most serious incident in the whole series, the Letby series of murders or crimes, whatever you want to call it. And it's almost as if the police are using this as a litmus test to see, can you get an answer to this that the consultant out of the hole, or get the hospital out of the hole, or get us out of the hole? Why would they jump to Baby O first? Why would they not show Baby A first? And if you're looking at photographs of a postmortem, it depends when the postmortem took place in relation to the death as to what the photographs are going to show. And it wouldn't be uncommon or striking really at all that a lot of the photographs and images that you see would look worse than they actually were, because they are post photographs and not photographs that were taken at the actual time of death, which Dowie seems oblivious to. He is engaged now in very simple storytelling, and he's engaged in deception here because he's not revealing to Raj what actually the photograph showed and what the findings of the postmortem. And what we now know from Mark's press conference, what the actual situation on the ground was, that the baby had been subject to excessive ventilatory pressure, which had pushed the liver down into the pelvis at the time that preceded the needle going in. In my opinion, is that he's trying to make sure he doesn't mention that, or in other words, he's just trying to get his story straight. And this is a story that he actually believes.
I also told him, and I think this was crucial as far as the trial is concerned, I said, if you suspect somebody or you suspect some people, I don't want to know. This is July 2017. What I need to get the notes of every baby who's died and every baby who's collapsed from January 2015 to July 2016.
Dowie is getting his sequence of events a bit off here now. He actually should have preceded the last explanation for Baby O with that comment, so that he doesn't know anything about the case. He's just looking at Baby O, and he doesn't know whether this is criminal act or what the police are alleging. This is what Dewi Evans says. But he's put this bit in after he has got the BBO one out of the way, which is quite suspicious to me in the way that he says it. And I think Raj misses a trick here by not asking him why he specifically chose the period January 2015 to July 2016. Because if he's choosing that period, it had to be because the police told him that that was the period that they were interested in. Now, Dowie has said all along that he didn't know the name Lucy Letby or that anyone was suspected of a crime or anything else. But how stupid do you need to be if the police ask you in to look at a case and say, tell us what you think about this? I mean, they're not They haven't got you there for an examination purpose. They've got you there for a reason that involves the work of the police. But they've obviously told Dowie more than he's said, because he is now reflecting back the dates and the period of time in which the police were interested. Well, they couldn't be interested in the overall mortality in the neonatal unit if they're only asking for a specific period. They are honing in already on a specific person.
Not just the suspicious ones or the ones you can't explain. I want all of them. So I ended up with 32 cases.
So I ended up with 32 cases. So there's your pauses that I'm talking about. To me, it's a clear case of construction of an answer rather than the spontaneity of an answer.
And I went through all of them. And of course, with many of them, it was obvious why the baby had died or why the baby had collapsed. There was a baby who was very premature, others who had suffered severe brain deficiency.
That would be baby C and baby I. Baby C weighed 800 grams, baby I weighed 504 grams. Both had very severe intrauterine growth restriction, and in the case of baby C, likely had the hypoxic brain damage in utero.
Hypoxia, lack of oxygen before birth, other babies had congenital problems.
Baby C, and we have to remember that 94% of all congenital problems occur in lower income third world countries, whatever you want to call it, and about 50% of them are likely not picked up at postmortem. So there's no way of knowing did any of the babies who died in the Letby series with certainty have congenital conditions.
So therefore, there was an explanation for the deaths and collapses of many of the babies.
There was an explanation for the death and collapses of all of the babies.
But I then discovered 12 babies increasing to 15.
Dowie's now telling us that his 30, that had increased to 32, has now gone down to 13 and is now 15. So what I think he means is that the 30 went down to 13 and the 2, which were the insulin cases found much later, brought it up to 15. Which begs the question, what happened to the original 30 that's now 15? Did the other 15 have congenital abnormalities and things that babies usually die from? At this point, Dowie is all over the place. And he's all over the place for the simple reason that Raj has allowed him to speak. And what he's telling us is that very soon after his involvement with Operation Hummingbird, it began to take shape, the shape that would eventually make its way into court, with the elimination of 15 cases and the additions of 2 more. But the time frame isn't the same as in other sources where the insulin cases were not noticed until much later. So Dowie's doing a lot of time traveling here to try and keep the story in his own mind because he believes this. And that is the critical thing. Dewi Evans believes it in the same way that you believe the sun is likely to rise.
Well, not only was there no explanation why these babies had collapsed, it made no sense at all. You know, babies don't simply collapse. If they stop breathing, getting a baby to start breathing again is quite straightforward.
If you've listened to all the other podcasts I've made, you will know that every single one of these babies at the point of collapse had metabolic acidosis. And metabolic acidosis is enough of a reason that a baby will not respond to resuscitation. But what Dewi is talking about here is the commoner garden apnea, an apnea attack which babies have all the time, as we said in one of the podcasts, up to 60 per day whenever they're measured, but not all of them are noticed. But these babies usually respond to stimulation or treatment or resuscitation. He is talking about a completely different matter than was the actuality of the situation that these babies find themselves.
But these babies died despite what I considered outstanding efforts to resuscitate them.
So let's recall some of the outstanding efforts to resuscitate them. Baby O, baby P, ventilatory baby P, double doses or toxic doses likely of a drug. Baby E, no blood products or blood transfusion. 3 or 4, not to mention the countless intubations, extubations, swapping machines, calling acidosis, alkalosis, not checking the electrolytes, not checking the lactates on baby A for 6 hours before his death, and not knowing what the lactates were 6 hours before his death. And Dewi Evans calls these good standards of resuscitation and care. But it's critical to his cognitive dissonance that he has to see the resuscitation efforts as excellent, because if they're not, then he can't live with the story that there's no explanation. And as I say, this is something he truly believes.
So this made no sense at all. And
he's right. It doesn't make any sense at all, which is the fundamental basis of cognitive dissonance.
Having ruled out the usual cause of collapse, it dawned on me that the only explanation was that these babies had suffered from an injection of air directly into the bloodstream, a condition called air embolus.
What Dewi's saying here is, for the record, every baby that has an apnea that cannot be explained and results in the death of the baby had an air embolism, which he will subsequently go on incongruously to tell us is a very rare event.
Now, every nurse and every doctor is aware that injecting air into the bloodstream is very, very dangerous. This is why we take great steps to ensure that no air gets into the bloodstream when you're giving an intravenous injection or giving intravenous fluids.
What Dewi is now saying is that the only way air can get into the vasculature of a neonate is by direct, deliberate injection into a cannula, which is complete contrast to the findings of the Lane-Tanswell paper, which he will quote subsequently as the major source of his theory on air embolism. The top 4 causes of air embolism in preterm neonates are umbilical catheter placement and handling, including the removal, mechanical ventilation, central venous lines, manipulation of them, and cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and necrotizing enterocolitis and bronchovenous. So that's where the alveoli rupture directly into a vein so that air is just going to pass directly in.
So it made no sense that this air had got in there accidentally. So I thought, oh my God, somebody's doing this. Now, this is happening intentionally.
There is, and oh my God, some of these do exist. Pause, and some of them are happening intentionally. How are we going to determine which ones are happening intentionally?
So I then said to the police, after identifying these 15 cases in the air, you need to look at the nursing rota and the medical rota for the time when this collapse or this death occurred. And you need to list all the nurses who were on duty and the doctors who were on duty at this collapse. And these collapses were all occurring in the middle of the night.
Number one, the collapses were not all happening at night. Number two, no doctors were listed. Number three, no ancillary workers were listed. And number four, all of this was pointed out when Berry presented his statistical sleuthing to the Royal College Pediatrics and Child, which they rejected in their subsequent listed the real reasons that the mortality rate was rising. Justice Goss then ruled as hearsay. So Dowie has just told us that he talked to a bunch of naive police officers, spun them a yarn about air embolism, and told them that all they had to do to find their killer was look at the roster for the nurses. Oh, and the doctors, but don't think too hard about the doctors. And if they find someone who is associated with the shift upon which these fantastical, extremely rare events that have multiple causes, which he didn't tell the police, occur, then that nurse is guilty of murder. Operation Hummingbird in a nutshell. And the rest of it is just window dressing.
And even after 4 cases, the first 4 cases, there was only one nurse who was on duty for all 4 cases, and that was Lucy Letby. Now, I didn't know that at the time, and I had completed all 15 reports before the name Lucy Letby was mentioned.
Now, if I was listening to a patient tell, I can hear a increase in pitch when he says at the time. There's a change in his pitch and tonation, and that would imply to me that he's not being truthful. That's just my opinion, and I would be honing in on that if it was in the context of a consultation. But we have a serious mathematical problem here. We're down to 15 cases. How were the 30 cases reduced to 13 and then increased to 15, and only Lucy Letby's name associated with them all? But not only that, we've been told by Cheshire Police and Dewi Evans that there will be multiple charges to follow, that there's going to be investigations into other babies, but they've already got 15 babies here that they haven't cleared up. And the reason that they haven't cleared them up, or have cleared them up, in fact, is because Lucy Letby's name is obviously not associated with them. And also, Dowie tells us that he had the records. Now, unless the police had compiled the records and then blanked out the name Lucy Letby on every single page of the tens of thousands of pages that would have compiled those records, Dewi Evans did see the name Lucy Letby, no matter what he says. Whether or not he made an association with it or not, I don't know. Personally, I believe he did, but that's just an opinion. And we'll hear more about this when Raj takes into him later on.
And I had completed all 15 reports before the name Lucy Letby was mentioned.
So to be, Evans is stating here that the name of Lucy Letby was how he heard the name Lucy Letby. And that, according to him, after he had completed the reviews. But the only people who could have mentioned Lucy Letby's name at this stage were Chester Police, the NCA, or the consultants. And this is very important because these are Dowie's initial reports. But in court, he presented many reports which he had subsequently compiled and edited and added to. And these can only have been added to with the knowledge of the name Lucy Letby, because he's telling us here that it was mentioned in 2017. That's how I hear it. But some of the reports given in court were written as late as 2019 or even later. Letby wasn't charged with murder until November 2020, 3 years later. So with regards to whether Dewi knew who Lucy Letby was or not, he's either lied to Raj here in this interview or he lied in court, because in court he said he didn't know the name Lucy Letby until he had heard it on the BBC. But to Rachel Lviv, he said, the Cheshire police informed me of Letby's arrest the day before she was named by press and media. Everyone who has ever used the term mentioned to me meant that they had heard it from someone else.
And of course, what I didn't know was that Lucy Letby had been removed from clinical practice in July 16. So, more than a year before I'd filed my reports. So when I identified these cases and her name came up in all 15 cases, the police were, very satisfied. In other words, they at last found some good evidence linking the collapse to a particular nurse.
People need to listen to that line over and over again until you make up your mind what it means to you. He alone, singularly, came up with all 15 charges, as he says, and they all just happened to have the name Lucy Letby on them. Now remember, he also said he started out with 30 cases, but we don't get any idea what happened to the other 15. And did any of those cases include the name Lucy Letby? But no matter, the police were very pleased with Dewi, and the rest, I suppose, is history. We have to remember too that all the other expert witnesses had read Dewi's reports before they compiled their own.
And then a little later in 2018, I reviewed 2 more cases, and these were the insulin poisoning cases. And these had not been suspected by anyone before this. And it's only thanks to Cheshire Police's methodical way of looking at cases that both insulin poisonings were the second of a pair of twins. And they asked me, just look at the notes. We've not had any concerns about this, but let's look at the notes just to cover all the options. And I discovered that the insulin level in both babies was higher than anything I've heard of or read about. So clearly, this was a baby who'd received insulin.
We don't use the term option in medicine. Option is only used when you're deciding whether or not to choose something. We use the term differential in medicine to distinguish one disease from another. In other words, we look at the possibilities that the data that we're interpreting can point us to. That's not an option. That's a conclusion that is either reasonable or not.
And I discovered that the insulin level in both babies was higher than anything I've heard of or read about.
Or indeed that anyone has heard of or read about, particularly in the case of baby F. But as we heard from Richard Taylor, the paediatrician or the neonatologist that's helping Mark MacDonald in his recent press conference, the sample that the insulin and C-peptide were taken from was a contaminated sample. And it was a contaminated sample verified by the laboratory technicians at the Countess of Chester Hospital. So we have 2 pieces of evidence here that are entirely at odds. The contamination means simply that the blood sample can't be used. The contamination can happen for many different reasons, but it generally means the blood test has to be repeated, which would have meant that all of the products, the data products of those blood analyses would have to be repeated. This insulin C-peptide, whether they like it or not, was taken from a contaminated sample, according to their own verification. And the verification showed that the serum insulin level for BBF at the time the blood sample was taken for the C-peptide, because of the same sample, was 54 millimoles per litre. And 54 millimoles per litre is an unsustainable and impossible level of glucose in the blood. And this is the problem when you start looking at options rather than differentials. Because if you're looking for a differential diagnosis, you would be analysing all the data. And clearly they didn't in this case. They looked at the insulin C-peptide, they said that there's an option, and they didn't backcheck it against the veracity of the actual sample. They've shot themselves in the foot. There is no way to begin with that this immunoassay test should be used in preterm neonates anyway, because it's never been validated for use in preterm neonates. And the sample was contaminated, not fit for clinical use, and certainly not fit for forensic use.
And it should not have. And this was in the 6th case, baby F, in our trial. And this gave us a smoking gun. We could now show that there was something going on here that one had suspected before.
So now he's confirming for us that the smoking gun, as he refers to it, was actually the product of a contaminated blood sample tested in a laboratory that advised users of the laboratory not to send those types of samples for immunoassays to it, but instead send them to the reference laboratory in Guildford.
Because, of course, if you inject air into the blood circulation, you can't see it. You can't test for it. It's very difficult to prove.
So Dewi tells us at last that he agrees with us that you can't see her, even though he's just back from a 9-month trial in which he claimed, along with other experts, that they could see her on x-rays. They made multiple claims that they could see her on x-rays, but you can't see her on x-rays, and Dewi agrees with us. And Dewi tells Raj, but didn't tell the jury, that there are means by which you can diagnose air embolism, and they're outlined in the very paper that he discusses, in the Tanswell paper. But they didn't apply those clinical tests to find air embolism. So instead, Dewi made up his own syndrome that would prove to a jury the existence of air embolism.
But one could now prove that there was a poisoner on the ward, as the prosecution put it. And again, with both insulin cases, the nurse involved with those babies was Lucy Letby.
Again, there were many people involved in the care of baby F, not just Lucy Letby. And he doesn't tell Raj here that they had to stretch the timeline and include the improbable mystery bags of TPN that could put Letby in the presence of BBF when she wasn't physically there. It's just such utter nonsense, but he doesn't want to boast about that one to Raj. I wonder why.
Said to the police, look, you need to send my report to another pediatrician, to a neonatologist, for peer review. And they sent the reports to Dr. Martin Ward Platt, who's a neonatologist in Newcastle upon Tyne, highly regarded, great guy. So he sent the report back, more or less saying he agreed with my interpretation of the clinical findings. So the police were very buoyed by that, and I was very pleased. Sadly, Martin became seriously ill and died.
Of course, what Dewi Evans didn't tell Raj was that Martin Ward Platt, along with Sir Roy Meadows, were involved with the false conviction of Angela Canning. And I doubt very much that Martin Platt would ever have been allowed over the door of a court again. God rest him.
And so the police brought in Dr. Sandy Bohin, and they sent my reports to her. And again, she came to the same conclusion, all apart from several of her reports I thought were better than mine.
And we'll touch on Sandy Bowen in the next episode.
And in addition to that, the X-rays were forwarded to a highly eminent radiologist from Great Ormond Street, a fellow Welsh guy, Owen Arthurs, who found very concerning issues in many of the babies who died, where he found air in the big blood vessels on X-ray. Now, you do get air post-mortem as a result of putrefaction, but this was quite unlike anything he'd seen before.
Which is proof of nothing.
And we're talking about baby A and baby D, and these were both babies where I'd made a clinical diagnosis of death via air embolus.
By ignoring the appalling medical care in both cases.
So having the backup not only of fellow pediatricians but also radiology strengthened the case of the cases significantly.
And as for his fellow countryman Owen Arthurs, what he said in the case of baby E was that in order to diagnose an air embolism from a chest X-ray, it would have to have a lot of gas present, and it would need to be done at the time it went into the body, which was not the case for any of the babies in the Letby air embolism series, rendering, in my opinion, all of the evidence that Owen Arthurs gave as utterly useless, because X-rays are not specific enough or good enough to prove anything in a murder case involving air embolisms, unless they meet the criteria that the professor set out himself, which none of them did.
So having the backup not only of fellow pediatricians but also radiology strengthened the case of the cases significantly. So the evidence was accumulating and accumulating, and I had to do a number of addendums.
By which time someone had mentioned the name Lucy Letby.
Because the Crown Prosecution Service wanted additional answers, which is very much the norm. And we had reports on the babies who died from Andreas Marnaridis in London,
the car crash man who found nothing unusual in the first case he was sent, baby A. He said that the cause of death was unascertained, as did the original pathologist, but Dr. Marnaridis managed to write some addendums as well.
Were very compelling, saying that the deaths were not due to one or more of the usual causes of death in babies. In fact, with the baby who had the liver trauma, he described it as the sort of finding you get in a road traffic accident.
Or if someone stabbed you in the liver with a needle when the liver's under enormous pressure.
So all of that information was available by 2019, and this led to the police charging Lucy Letby with the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 10 babies in November 2022, and she was put on remand and remained in prison from that time on.
So let's just discuss this air embolism diagnosis that you've mentioned. You said it's very difficult to diagnose at one level. Then you told me it was possible to diagnose it using tests like X-rays. So if it's possible to see it on an X-ray, why did the original hospital and the original doctors not make the diagnosis earlier before you arrived?
Professor Arthurs has already given us the answer to that question. There needs to be a certain criteria which was not present in any of the babies.
Very difficult. It was only found on X-ray on the post-mortem of the first and fourth babies, and this was actually reported by the local pediatrician. By the local radiologist. So it was reported, but its significance was not appreciated, and I think its significance was not appreciated because it's a well-known fact that air can accumulate in bodies after death.
In other words, they rightly discarded it because it wasn't proof of anything.
And it's a condition that is incredibly rare. We are so careful in avoiding accidental injection of air into patients, and modern equipment almost makes it almost impossible to do so anyway.
Not true.
So it's a phenomenon that none of the team in Chester had ever seen.
Every doctor is well able to make diagnoses of diseases that they've never seen.
And the scientific papers regarding this condition go back decades, really.
Again, not true.
The most commonly quoted scientific paper was 30 years old.
Again, that's not true. Diagnosis and Treatment of Vascular Air Embolism, published in the Journal of Anesthesiology in 2007, has been cited by 565 publications with 729 citation statements and is referenced by 153 other publications. I can find 2 citations of the Lane-Tanswell paper, and most of the discussion of the Lane-Tanswell paper happened after 2023 if you look at the website where it was initially published.
But it is a very good paper, and I must have been aware of it, because not only did I know about the fact that air embolus can cause sudden unexpected collapse and death, but I also noted on the second baby this peculiar abnormality of the skin. There was discoloration of the skin that came and went. And this was noted in a number of the babies, most of whom died, not all.
Again, this was totally untrue. There was one baby out of the 50 that were described in this paper suffering from pulmonary vascular air embolism, which is an entirely different diagnosis and circumstance than Dewi Evans is trying to explain here.
And was documented in many babies, but not all.
Again, not true. This specific rash or skin discoloration that Dewi Evans is talking about wasn't documented in any of the cases. He quotes it was added later from memory by Dr. Jairam and others.
Because the medical team clearly didn't appreciate the significance of this discoloration.
Because it had no significance.
Of the skin, in addition to the presence of air on X-ray, which again added to the diagnosis. And I described it as a full house in evidence in one case where if one had a baby who was stable, not requiring much in the way of intensive care, who suddenly collapsed, where there was skin discoloration, where there was air found in blood vessels, and who was unable to be resuscitated, and where you could rule out the usual cause of collapse in babies, such as infection or hemorrhage, then that gave you a very good clinical presentation consistent with that baby having been or being the victim of an injection of air into its circulation.
Again, untrue. There is no clinical or pathological evidence of air embolism in any of these babies. And even if there were, it is not possible to distinguish the source of the air.
Okay, but I'm still a bit confused. You're saying that on 2 occasions, the hospital or the doctors were aware there was air in the body, but on the others, they weren't. So that was a diagnosis then made post hoc, a long
Oh,
time after.
no. No. In two of the babies, air was reported on the postmortem X-ray.
Dr. Raj is right. It was ignored because it had no clinical significance and only became important when Dewi Evans came along. 1 no would suffice Dewi instead of 5, and the diagnoses were made post hoc by you.
By the clinicians.
Okay. What about the other babies?
One baby had air found on in the brain.
Again, not true. This is baby A, who was said to have globules in the brain, but the globules were never subject to any analysis to tell the pathologist what they contained. So no one knows if there was air in the globules, nitrogen in the globules, or any other kind of gas.
And again, that was not appreciated by the clinicians as something that you get with air embolus. It was assumed that this was something that had occurred as a result of the degeneration that takes place following death.
And without gas chromatography to analyse the gas, that is the only assumption that a scientist can make.
Okay, but what about the others? There were several others where air embolus was implicated.
After listening to Dewi rambling on for the last 25 minutes or whatever it is, Raj is finally smelling a rat.
These were babies who were stable, were well, who suddenly deteriorated, who had this pattern of discoloration. If it is a tiny amount of air, they recovered. If they were sickening for an infection, they would not make a prompt recovery. So they recovered, but again, deteriorated, some of them within an hour or two afterwards. So therefore, we were dealing with something that is, literally unique, I suspect.
And he's rambling on, but there is one thing that I would really agree with them on this. It is unique, and it was made so by Dewi Evans. No other physician that I know would make these illogical conclusions that he does. And I think he's going to be torn to shreds when the reports come out of what really happened to the babies. You've had a slight hint of that already in the cases of baby C, baby O, and baby F that were mentioned at Mark McDonald's press conference.
But was the diagnosis definitively made by X-ray in every baby where you suspected air embolus?
No, it wasn't. This is
only 4 no's that time, Dewi.
The X-rays in several of these babies showed nothing untoward. And this is hardly surprising because
they didn't have air emboli.
If you're looking for air, small amounts of air in an X-ray of a chest, for instance, where you've got air in a vessel overlooking air in the lung, that air is not going to be visible.
Remember, no air is visible on X-ray.
You won't be able to see it.
But how do you know the diagnosis is air embolus in those cases then?
Because these are cases where your diagnosis is made by ruling out other factors, and you end up with a diagnosis where this is the only explanation. You ruled everything out. What's left is the diagnosis.
No. What's left when you rule everything out in medicine is a patient that doesn't have a disease.
Okay. So why then switch to insulin if you've got this one person doing these acts? They're using air embolus. I think they use 1 or 2 other means. Why switch to insulin at the end?
Clearly, I can't answer that. We do use insulin in babies because babies sometimes run a glucose value that's too high and therefore may require a bit of insulin to get the metabolic state stable. And insulin is available. It's in the fridge. One can draw up a little bit of insulin quite easily, inject it into a intravenous bag of 500 ml of fluid. Why you do it, I have no idea. But what I think is important is that there was more than one way where these babies were harmed. There was, apart from insulin and injecting air into the bloodstream, several of the babies had milk or milk and air injected into the stomach.
No, they didn't, because you've now withdrawn that, Danny, and you have said that that is not a means by which they were killed.
Several of the babies had milk or milk and air injected into the stomach. And some babies suffered direct trauma to the mouth and throat sufficient to cause bleeding. So there was, apart from insulin, there was three main lines of attack, as it were. Air into the circulation, which is what caused the death, I think, in all the babies. Air or milk injected into the stomach. If you inject a large volume of fluid or fluid and air into the stomach becomes distended. This makes it more difficult for the baby to breathe because the diaphragm is unable to move up and down, and you will get a sudden deterioration.
You will recall from the Rachel Aviv article that Dewi couldn't find a paper anywhere on earth that explained this phenomena, and neither have I, and I don't believe any other doctor has found any citation that quotes this as a means of harming a baby, which is likely why he has withdrawn it.
And this is something I've never seen before and never seen since. But that was a condition that was easier to prove because one particular baby, this is baby G, was stable, almost ready to go home, was fed by nasogastric tube, where you put milk in a syringe and allow the milk to trickle through by gravity, and was receiving 45 ml of milk every 3 hours, standard practice. So on this particular occasion, the nurse looking after her gave her 45 mils of milk, let the milk trickle through, and went for a break. When she was away for a break, our nurse came along, and the baby ended up with a massively distended stomach, vomited all over the nursery, what was described as projectile vomiting. And despite vomiting all over the nursery, there was still 45 ml of milk left in the stomach. So there's only one explanation for that, which is that that baby had had far more milk than she should have, and also that that milk had been forcefully injected into the stomach, because if it had gone down by gravity, once the pressure in the stomach had increased a little, no more milk would have trickled into the stomach. So therefore, this was a case of inflicted trauma.
And after all that drill, it should be pointed out that the case of baby Q was an attempted murder charge for which there was no verdict. So no matter what Dewi says, even the jury wasn't buying him on this one. But again, I think it gives us a little insight into how little insight this man has about himself.
And several babies had milk or milk and air injected into their stomachs, as well as finally having air injected into the bloodstream. So the presence of again, x-rays with hugely enlarged stomachs and loads of air in the intestines, something one just does not see in little babies. You don't. So one was constantly seeing things. I thought, good heavens, what's going on here? It's something one has never seen. And again, we had our radiologists and everyone else coming up with the same opinion. This is something one does not see. This baby must have had a significant amount of air injected into its stomach for the stomach to blow up in this way. Because, of course, babies have a tube connecting the stomach to the outside. So if there's pressure in the stomach, the air will leak out through the tube. So the baby should never have a stomach that is under pressure. So it was very bizarre and beyond one's understanding, really.
Yes, it is bizarre and probably beyond anyone's understanding, which is why you changed your mind after the trial.
Okay. I get a sense that one has to have the kind of technical knowledge you have to make these diagnoses, but there were other pediatricians on the job, as it were, in that unit. I still don't quite understand why they didn't connect the dots. You came along and connected the dots afterwards. Why were they not able to connect the dots at the time? I've got that right.
Yes, you do have that right, Raj. No one was able to connect the dots until Dewi came along. That's the whole point of this podcast. And it's something that everyone should stop and ask themselves. How is it that it was only Dewi that could connect the dots?
That is right. That is correct. Clearly, well, the first of all is you don't think that there's someone in your unit who's deliberately causing harm.
Again, not true. According to them, they all suspected Letby of causing harm
to your babies. That's the first thing. The second point, though, which I only heard about towards the end of the trial, was that the doctors, although they had connected the dots with regard to the cause of this baby's collapse, they had woken up to the fact that these events were occurring when Lucy Letby was on duty after the first 4 babies, so during June 2015, and had raised this with hospital management.
But sadly for the babies involved, they didn't raise it where they should have raised it. And Dr. J. Ram has been criticised for that by the Court of Appeal.
And I think they raised it again in October 2015.
No, what the record shows is that Alison Timmins raised it with management to say that babies were going to die or staff were going to suffer because they were overworked and understaffed.
And the evidence they said in court was that you had no evidence to show that Lucy Letby was responsible for these collapses and that you should not make a fuss. Now, where they went wrong was they failed to work out what or had caused the baby's collapse. So they'd worked out who was causing the problems, but not how, and also not with what. And it's only towards the end of the trial that one of the local pediatricians said that we had a meeting at the end of June 2016, so right at the end of these events, where one of them said, this must be due to air embolus. This must be due to air embolus. And he said in his evidence, that you then, of course, Google all of this. Let's Google air embolus. Let's find out what's been written about it in the scientific papers. And they discovered a couple of scientific papers that not only describe babies who'd suffered in exactly the same way as some of their babies, but these babies that also have this very peculiar skin discoloration.
Back to this old trope again. I've discovered hundreds of papers on air embolism, none of which mention skin discoloration for consideration in the diagnosis.
And it's only after reading those papers that the penny dropped with the local team. Oh my God, we've overlooked something that is very, very important and very significant, i.e. skin discoloration. And they hadn't cottoned on to the fact that the collapse and the skin discoloration and air embolus were all connected.
Again, listen to the staccato speech pattern whenever he's telling his tall tale about Lucy Letby. Compare that to his speech pattern when he's talking about anything else.
So it took them until the end of June 2016 for them to connect all the dots in relation to what had caused the collapse.
Okay, but is it possible? I'm going to say something that may be very, very unfair. But you know more about. You're a jobbing pediatrician. You've been in there. You did the job. Is it possible that they were just like? And I don't mean to make them sound uncaring or not very good doctors. But was it the case maybe they were very busy dealing with lots of other things, and babies die, unfortunately, very tragically from time to time, and as a result, it was difficult for them to extract this particular pattern in a very busy clinical service where babies also die for, natural causes. Was their vision clouded? And you came along and you only had one thing to think about. It was easier for you to see the thing in front of you compared to them. Were they distracted in some sense by the busyness of their clinical practice or other things?
These guys did 2 ward rounds a week in neonatology, and when you read the cases, you find them absent from practically every emergency and every decision that was made with regards to these babies who were inappropriately placed in their unit.
Yes, I think they were too close to the action and they couldn't see the wood for the trees. And the fact that I was 180 miles away, no axe to grind, what on earth's going on here, pretty well read. This is the only conclusion I can come to. So yes, I don't know, by the way, to this day, whether they have or have had regular perinatal meetings. I mean, it should be routine that every department should have regular meetings where you discuss deaths on your department, collapses on your department, and share the thoughts with your fellow nursing and medical people.
Now, there's a good example of Dory's normal speech pattern, but just to let him know in case he hasn't found out, the mechanism is much more complex nowadays for risk management. That's what he's talking about, learning points, risk management. It's much more sophisticated. But sadly, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health gave them a poor mark for participating in risk management, the consultant that is at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Now, I introduced perinatal mortality meetings in Swansea in the 1980s. And these were meetings that were held most months. Everything was minuted. And if you had doubts, you'd have a word with medics from other departments.
It's astonishing that Dowie doesn't seem to know that all of that actually did happen in nearly every one of these cases. The babies had postmortems, all of them had coroner's reviews, but none of them are reported within the risk system of the hospital, according to that report. Now, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health said that they gave the guys a pass by saying that the mechanism for reporting was a new system. But in my book, that's no excuse. So Dowie is totally out of date here. Little local perinatal meetings didn't cut the mustard, which is why they were got rid of. And we have a much more sophisticated pathway now through the Child Death Oversight Panel, which, if they had used, they would have saved some of these babies from the fate that they suffered, because they would have been downgraded earlier.
They did speak to another neonatologist from the Northwest. I don't know what his opinion was. This was around October 2015. But they didn't hit on the diagnosis of air embolus until the end of June 2016. And they did not think that the abdominal distension and the vomiting that was found in several babies was other than, well, babies will vomit.
I couldn't have put it better myself, Dewi. Babies will vomit, they'll get abdominal distension, they'll have apneas and collapses and disease, like all of these babies did.
Is it possible that, linked to that point I'm making, that the NHS is overwhelmed, it's underfunded, and there's a drive towards efficiency? So the management is preoccupied with throughput all the time, getting patients in and out fast, as quickly as possible. Is there a sense in which, in the old days, where the criticism of doctors was we were always on golf courses? I don't think that was ever really true. But anyway, that grand rounds and time to think about patients, as opposed to constantly having your nose to the grindstone, has produced this kind of culture where it's difficult for doctors to take a step back and think about what's going on in their units, as opposed to just being run ragged by the demands of these incessant targets.
The opposite is the case now. All they have to do is report properly, and other people, risk managers, will do the work for them. But they didn't report, and that was what their problem was. And they didn't report because they didn't seem to know what was going on in their unit, in my opinion.
There were 5 consultants in Chester looking after not only the babies, but also the children. My contemporaries in Chester, during the 80s and 90s, there were just the 2 of them. So it's not a big unit. It's not a big department. I mean, my Swansea department in the 80s was 2 to 3 times the size of their unit. And there were just 4 of us as consultants. And we covered the neonatal service and the children's service. I just think that they missed it. They just missed it.
They didn't miss the liver, Dewi. They absolutely didn't miss it.
And, they will be kicking themselves until the day they retire.
I think somebody else is going to be kicking them before they retire.
But they did. They nearly got it on several occasions.
But in 2014, one of them hit the esophagus instead.
But I think what stopped them was the intransigence of the hospital managers.
We didn't ignore the risk and called in the RCPCH and the review of all the cases when they realised what the situation was. Had they had proper datix reporting and system reporting before that, they would have been forced to move.
They got ignored. They got ignored by the hospital managers. That is not in any way surprising to me, but that is absolutely shocking.
So Dewi continues on, and I'll leave you a link to the podcast, the Raj Persaud podcast, and you can see for yourself. He just keeps rambling on about how bad managers are. He doesn't really give you the impression that he truly understands the nature of what he's involved with now. The team of people that Mark MacDonald, Lucy Letby's new defence lawyer, has gathered together is extraordinary. Outside of a war situation or a national emergency on something like that scale, no one has ever assembled such a group of people that are working, as Mark said, around the clock to give their knowledge free and expose this little fraudster for what he is, because it's the integrity of medicine itself that's on trial here. I don't doubt for 1 minute that this is a Herculean task for Mark MacDonald, and I wouldn't be overly optimistic, in fact, about Lucy Letby's near future. But the judiciary is about to face an onslaught, the likes of which they have never dealt with before. And when these judges are forced to place the evidence that's gathering storm behind the scenes up beside the bullshit that Dewi Evans talks, I think they're going to feel actually quite embarrassed. And I don't necessarily think that that is a good thing for Letby. The General Medical Council, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, and all of these other people are going to be subject to scrutiny too, because for decades now they've been pushing the narrative that doctors use evidence-based medicine. And there is no evidence base for the way that these families were treated when they attended the Countess of Chester Hospital to have their children. They were treated despicably, each and every one of them. The Latin title of this episode, Homo, homini, lupus est, roughly translates as man is wolf to man. And many people have put their own interpretation on it. It's actually part of a line from a Roman play written over 2,000 years ago. And most people take it to mean that unless we follow the rules of society, civilization, or the law, whatever you want to call it, human nature tends to default to its basest predatory instincts, and the innocent become prey. It's only a question at any one time in history as to who is the prey and who is the hunter. And as we progress through this saga, Letby's hunters are about to feel the bite of the wolf. I leave you with the last question, or one of the last questions that Raj asked Dewi, and I'll let you guess what his answer was. And see you in the next episode. And I hope everyone has a peaceful and happy Christmas. Bye.
Okay, so I'm gonna come at you from a slightly different angle. You may or may not be aware that there are 2 cases of nurse serial killers in Europe where, on appeal, those cases have been overturned and the nurses were released for various reasons that we can't go into necessarily in great detail now. But one key point was that the main evidence against those 2 nurses was that they happened to be on duty at the time when people died, in a way that suggested that they must have died through nefarious means. And the point with nurse serial killers around the world is that often this is the key point about how they get convicted, because it's very difficult. In a normal homicide where a body is found stabbed 20 times on a street, deciding that a homicide has occurred is pretty straightforward. And the chain of evidence that leads to you finding the culprit is also often not that complicated, unlike what TV dramas and film dramas would lead you to believe. In a hospital setting where people are often seriously ill, establishing that a homicide has actually occurred, given that deaths occur in hospital, is a bit trickier than, other kinds of homicides. And sometimes juries are overly impressed with the statistical argument that the chances of a particular nurse being on duty when 10 people die in some unexpected ways, is just like 1 in 70 million or 1 in 300 million. These statistics have been bandied around. So would you accept that in some cases, historically, the nurses have won on appeal, and that sometimes, at least on 2 occasions, famously recently, the last 10 or 15 years, that the evidence against them, I'm not saying in this case, the evidence sounds very different from the way you very eloquently it over, but sometimes the system, the judicial system, and the healthcare system can make mistakes in choosing the wrong people. I don't know whether you'd agree with that.